That thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Now, thank you all for coming out. Tonight I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about Aleister Crowley, the author of Conan, the Conan stories, Robert E. Howard, and the author and originator of the Cthulhu mythos, H.P. Lovecraft. So a lot of this is going to be just personal reflections, personal things, feelings that I'm working out about these three individuals, and hopefully I can get some reactions, questions from you all. So I'm hoping to have a little more dialogue tonight if we can get through the material fast enough. I hope I haven't overloaded it. So I want to start by telling you why I'm comparing these three people in particular. Crowley, Conan, and Cthulhu, or rather Crowley, H.P. Lovecraft, and Robert E. Howard. All of them were writing in the 1920s and 1930s. Of course, Crowley had started writing long before that. The Book of the Law was received in 1904, and Crowley passed away in 1947, and even at that date, he was writing the Book of Thoth, The Magic Without Tears, so he was very prolific, whereas Lovecraft and Howard basically were writing for pulp magazines in the 1920s and 30s. But I still think that it is worth comparing them because they are three Anglo-Saxon white English speakers, all three of them being post-Christian, and all of them reacting to the world as it was beginning to appear in the early 20th century. So here was a world where the mechanistic idea of nature is a big machine that you had the 19th century beginning to sink in. People are beginning to see that there's no place for God in the cogs of this big wheel of mechanical nature. And then at the same time, you have the discoveries of Einstein and quantum theory and other things making the universe even weirder. Just when they thought they had figured it out, that we have this material universe with no God, and now suddenly we don't know where things are. Matter is mostly empty space and can be converted into energy. So that if people were trying to wrap their heads around that. And then, of course, you have the theory of evolution, that people are descended from apes. And then you have Freud revealing that all of our art and religion and poetry and literature is all coming from the id, from these like primal desires. So it was a period of very deep disillusionment. Also, the world was getting smaller at the same time. There were advances in transportation, communications. A world war had just been fought in between 1916, 1918. Actually, I think it was like 15 it started. 14, thanks. So the world was getting smaller, and suddenly there's all these strange people that, European Anglo-Saxons and other, these white European nations are having to confront. And it was becoming very scary for them. So Lovecraft and Howard, writing in the 20s and 30s for these pulp magazines, were giving voice, I believe, to this fear of the other, this fear of this new, strange, indifferent, godless universe. And they reacted to it in different ways, which I'll get into when I go through some of their stories. Crowley, on the other hand, reacted in a very different way. He was a much more worldly person. He was a world traveler. He was a big game hunter. He was a mountain climber who set records during his lifetime. He was, of course, obviously an occultist and explored things that other people did not dare to think about. So he had a very different view and reaction to the world of the early 20th century. So I would like to kind of compare and contrast these different figures. The first thing, though, is a little detour to William Butler Yeats, who wrote a poem called The Second Coming. And I think it kind of sums up, it was written, as a matter of fact, in 1920, and I think it expresses a lot of the fears and trepidation that people felt in the early 20th century in the European countries among English speakers. And I believe that he was probably also making a little dig in here towards Crowley, who even by that time was calling himself the Great Beast. And Yeats and Crowley had both been members of the Golden Dawn and were definitely not on speaking terms. So here is the second coming. Turning and turn. Oh, before I read it, how many of you have read this or heard this before? Just three of you? Or about half? Okay.
It's a book I read in high school.
Was it?
Things Fall Apart. Yeah, this
Right.
is the intro to that.
So, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. That is the opener. We'll begin talking about Robert E. Howard. How many of you here have read any of Howard? 1, 2, 3, 4 of you. And are the rest of you familiar with him, of him? Okay. So I know about Howard because in the 1970s when I started reading comic books, there was one of the most popular comics at the time was Conan. And it was loosely based, some more, some less, upon the stories that Robert E. Howard wrote about Conan the Barbarian, who I'm sure most of you know about the movies, especially starring Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Grace Jones.
In Grace Jones. I remember when my daughter was growing up showing her the first Conan movie, and I was saying, "Look, Julie, there's our governor."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what a lot of people
Wow.
don't realize is that the Conan stories were written way back in the I guess mostly they were written in the 30s. In fact, it's right on my timeline, 1932 to 1936. So they've been around a long time, maybe not quite as long as Tarzan and others, which are horribly written. I think Howard was actually I think he was a good writer. He may not be literature exactly, but I still find enjoyment reading his stories, though, as I'm going to reveal, I'm a little embarrassed by it now. But first I want to talk about Robert E. Howard, the person. He lived from 1906 to 1936. He spent most of his youth and teenage years with his family wandering from boomtown and cow towns in Texas. So it was a very wild period at that time. A lot of his stories were inspired by the rough kind of people that he met who were coming for the flocking to Texas for the oil boom and still in the cattle trade. In 1919, his family moved to Cross Plains, Texas, which also became a boom town. He did travel around in the southeast and down to New Orleans, but he never really left that region of the country. So that was his home and place. 1930, in 1926 is when he started writing for the pulp magazines. Those were like cheap kind of anthologies of adventure stories that were written in those days. In 1926, he began writing them. His stories ranged from boxing tales to detective stories to historical adventures, and then eventually to the Conan stories. In 1930, he began a correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft, and I don't think it would be stretching things too much to say that he was kind of a protege of Lovecraft. And some people would consider that the Conan stories in the fictional world that he created could be considered part of the Cthulhu mythos, which we'll get into a little later. And Howard never really had a relationship in his life. He never married. There was a woman that he was in love with. He kind of tentatively was seeing her for a few years in the 30s, but eventually I think she married like one of his friends. He spent most of his adulthood taking care of his mother, who was very sick. And when she fell into a coma, he committed suicide, shooting himself in the head in 1936. So Howard, in many ways, had a very sad, kind of lonely, restricted life. Although he was a boxer himself, he tried to play up the image of the tough guy, but basically he was kind of a more sensitive, literary kind of person. Let's see, is there anyone else? Yes.
Didn't they come out with a movie about him?
If they did, I don't know about it.
I can talk about it.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, actually.
Okay, well, in 1996, Vincent D'Onofrio played Robert E. Howard in a film called Whole Wide World. It's a lovely film. It's based on the memoir by the English teacher he dated.
Oh,
Her
okay.
name was Novelyn Price.
Novelist, yeah.
And and she's played by Renee Zellweger. So it's a deeply romantic film, and surprisingly shows something of a writer's life that film can't usually capture. So and it does show his loneliness and his inability,
Right.
to really
Form a deep
connect with her.
relationship.
Yeah.
Right.
And but it's one of those kind of obscure films, even though D'Onofrio was a kind of a known actor, but a low budget.
Wait,
and-
Vincent, the one who plays Kingpin in the Daredevil?
Yeah.
What a very
I think of him as making his
He's good.
debut in Full Metal Jacket.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, right, he was the
Gomer
guy.
Pyle.
Oh my God! Wow.
And he was in the 13th Floor, which is
Right, 13.
Yeah.
another remarkable science
Right.
fiction.
Oh, I got his whole wide world.
It's,
Whole
it
Wide
sounds
World.
like
And you
is
should
it
be able to get it
independent
from Netflix.
film? Independent film?
Yeah.
Any particular reason why that period, why that year?
1936?
No,
Or-
why the film came out? What
Oh yeah,
interest
what was going on then?
that drew interest to Robert E. Howard?
Well, I don't know.
Wonder.
I don't know too much about why that film got made, but I
Maybe
can
it was the
say.
governor.
I mean, he was the governor.
But there is this whole Robert E. Howard fandom that has annual events in Cross Plains, Texas,
Oh.
and they might have been getting started around that time. So
Okay.
that might have been,
Yeah, some
one
kind
of the waves
impetus
of.
happened.
I
Yeah.
think they were also republishing a lot of his books at that time.
Conan.
There is anthologies.
Right.
You know,
Okay,
so yeah.
probably. Okay.
Okay.
And that memoir by Novelyn Price came out, and it caught the eye
Right.
of this film.
Okay.
Excellent. I definitely want to see that movie now. Yeah.
Oh, my world.
So, moving along, I want to talk about one of my favorite Conan stories, The Queen of the Black Coast. Now, because many of the themes that I want to compare and contrast with Crowley pop up in this story. I first read it in the comic book form, where the comic writer Roy Thomas had taken what is essentially it's not even long enough to be called a novella, really. I think it's like 30, 40 pages long, if that. It's a longer short story, but it's still a short story. And he stretched it out for like 100 issues. There's some crazy amount of issues, and Roy Thomas, I'm talking about here, he fleshed out all the characters, he created intricate back plots, he humanized everybody in it. So that by the time I read The Queen of the Black Coast, and by the way, I read the edited version by Lynn Carter and Sprague de Camp, and they did a real job on Howard's originals. They kind of edited out some things that people in the 70s might have found offensive or upsetting. So I never...
What was offensive and upsetting, Michael?
Racist stuff,
Oh.
primarily. Yeah, and then there was some sexist things in there too. I don't know if it was so much in Queen of the Black Coast, but I was reading the versions of the Conan stories put out in anthologies by Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. So when I read the Queen of the Black Coast, when I read it now, when I read Howard's original version, there's a lot of stuff in there that I find deeply disturbing. And it makes it kind of awkward for me to talk about how much I enjoy the story, because I have to acknowledge that there's this side of it that's, to our sensibilities, is kind of disturbing, and I'll get into that. So, that is Queen of the Black Coast. Oh, so what happens in this story is Conan is this kind of Celtic strongman warrior type who comes down from the north into the more civilized southern lands, and he wanders about in these kind of like pseudo-Egypt and pseudo-medieval France and pseudo-Middle East. In fact, a lot of the Conan stories were rewritten versions of more historical stories that Howard took and just turned it into a Conan story. And in the course of his wanderings, he befriends a soldier who gets in trouble with a commanding officer, and there's a trial, and in redneck fashion, instead of turning evidence on his friend the soldier, Conan kills the judge in the courtroom, flees, hijacks a ship, and then heads out into the open seas, whereupon he learns that there are bloodthirsty pirates about, led by a beautiful woman named Bali, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. So here's the description that he gets from the captain of the ship he's hijacked. So they beat southward, and Master Tito began to look for the high-walled villages of the black people. But they found only smoking ruins on the shore of a bay, littered with naked black bodies. Tito swore, "I had good trade here aforetime. This is the work of pirates. And if we meet them," Conan loosened his great blade in its scabbard. "Mine is no warship. We run, not fight. Yet if it came to a pinch, we have beaten off reavers before and might do it again, unless it were Beli's tigress." "Who is Beli?" "The wildest she-devil unhanged. Unless I read the signs are wrong, it was her butchers who destroyed that village on the bay. May I someday see her dangling from the yardarm. She is called the Queen of the Black Coast. She is a Shemite woman who leads black raiders. They harry the shipping and have sent many a good tradesman to the bottom." Okay, so just keep this in mind. I'm going to move on and get back to it, but she's a Shemite woman, pseudo-Semite, Jewish woman, leading a bunch of black pirates to attack white European shipping. Okay.
Yep.
This completely went over my head when I was like 13 reading this story. Like, wow, what an exciting adventure story. And completely missing the redneck fantasy in here. So, Beli's ship is indeed the one that attacked the villages on the shore, and she attacks the ship that Conan is on. Conan kills half the crew, and I swear in like most of the Conan stories, if there's all this huge bloodshed going on, like almost guaranteed it's like foreplay for him to get the girl and they run off to the bedroom. So that's what happens here. He kills like half her crew. He's the last man standing on his ship, and then she's so in love with his manliness that she strips naked and does this like seductive dance and tells him that from now on she's her co-captain. Yes, the way it should be. There you go. So,
That's cool.
yes, in fact, here's the description, and you can see some of the tropes going on here of the ideas of the different kinds of the barbarians and the civilized man and all this stuff. "You are no soft Hyborian," she exclaimed. "You are fierce and hard as a gray wolf. Those eyes were never dimmed by city lights. Those thews were never softened by life amid marble walls." "I am Conan, a Cimmerian," he answered. "To the people of the exotic climes, the north was a mazy half-mythical realm, peopled with ferocious blue-eyed giants, who occasionally descended from their icy fastnesses with torch and sword. Their raids had never taken them as far south as Shem, and this daughter of Shem made no distinction between Aesir, Vanir, or Cimmerian. With the unerring instinct of the elemental feminine, she knew she had found her lover, and his race meant naught, save as it invested him with the glamour of far lands. And I am Belize," she cried, as one might say, "I am queen." So,
Wow.
there you go. I love purple prose. I really do.
Wow.
Yeah. What happens next is they according to the story, spend several years raiding a set of stories about it. And eventually they come to a river where supposedly there is this lost city deep into the jungle. And Beli convinces Conan that they should go investigate it. And on the way, they begin talking philosophy. And this is part I want to share, because I think in some ways it reflects Howard's view and the view of a lot of other people about the kind of godless universe they felt they were living in at that time in the 1920s, 30s. The cold light struck icy fire from the jewels in Belize's clustered black locks as she stretched her lithe figure on the leopard skin thrown on the deck. Supported on her elbows, her chin resting on her slim hands, she gazed up into the face of Conan, who lounged beside her, his black mane stirring in the faint breeze. Belize's eyes were dark jewels burning in the moonlight. Mystery and terror are about us, Conan, and we glide into the realm of horror and death, she said. Are you afraid? A shrug of his mailed shoulders was his only answer. I am not afraid either, she said meditatively. I was never afraid. I have looked into the naked fangs of death too often. Conan, do you fear the gods? I would not tread on their shadow, answered the barbarian conservatively. Some gods are strong to harm, others to aid, at least so say their priests. Mitra, the Hyborians, must be a strong god because his people have builded their cities over the world. But even the Hyborians fear Set. And Bel, god of thieves, is a good god. When I was a thief in Zamora, I learned of him. What of your own gods? I have never heard you call on them. Their chief is Crom. He dwells on a great mountain. What use to call on him? Little he cares if men live or die. Better to be silent than to call his attention to you. He will send you dooms, not fortune. He is grim and loveless, but at birth he breathes power to strive and slay into a man's soul. What else should men ask of the gods? So, we have a very Nietzschean kind of philosophy here.
Doesn't Crom reflect Yahweh? I mean,
I would, no,
no.
I don't think so.
I mean, Yahweh was a mountain god.
Yeah, but Yahweh cared about his chosen people, even if he was kind of showing tough love more than half the time, whereas Crom is indifferent. So here we have, the 20th century, early 20th century man speaking through a supposed, prehistoric barbarian, saying, I mean, what pre-industrial or agricultural man would talk this indifferently and agnostically? I mean, maybe,
Voltaire, maybe.
Voltaire, yeah, but see, even then, you're getting like post-Renaissance, right?
Yeah.
So really, this idea that maybe there's gods, but they don't care about us, and they're just likely to just take a whack at us is help us. And in fact, just 20 years. If this was written in the 1930s, about 20 years before was when the Titanic happened.
Yeah.
And the poet Thomas Hardy wrote about the god who deliberately made it happen just because people dared him to. So, this is very early 20th century kind of attitude, I think. But the conversation goes on and gets even more philosophical. But what are the worlds beyond the river of death? She persisted. There is no hope here or hereafter in the cult of my people, answered Conan. In this world men struggle and suffer vainly, finding pleasure only in the bright madness of battle. Dying, their souls enter a gray misty realm of clouds and icy winds to wander cheerlessly throughout eternity. So, Belize shuddered. Life, bad as it is better than such a destiny. What do you believe, Conan? He shrugged his shoulders. I've known many gods. He who denies them is as blind as he who trusts them too deeply. I seek not beyond death. It may be the blackness averred by the Nemedian skeptics, or Crom's realm of ice and cloud, or the snowy plains and vaulted halls of the Nordheimers' Valhalla. I know not, nor do I care. Let me live deep while I live. Let me know the rich juices of red meat and stinging wine on my palate, the hot embrace of white arms, the mad exultation of battle and the blue blades flame in crimson, and I am content. Let teachers and priests and philosophers brood over questions of reality and illusion. I know this, if life is illusion, then I am no less an illusion, and being thus, the illusion is real to me. I live, I burn with life, I love, I slay, and am content.
Yeah, that's way too good. I like that. I slay. I'm gonna have to remember that.
Yeah. Can you hear Arnold Schwarzenegger delivering these lines when he was younger? Yeah. Actually, the writing in the Conan movies is nowhere near as fun as this material.
He only had 7 lines in the first film.
That's true, right.
Conan the Grammarian.
So, now what happens next is Belize greed leads them to the city, and she betrays her own men to get at these jewels, where she sees a trap and she deliberately has her men open it up. So between her greed and the ignorance and, basically stupidity of the crew, maybe that's a little strong, but, they all get wiped out, except Conan. Conan, chasing after his men, falls asleep under what's called a black lotus plant that gives him these dreams of this ancient city in the deep past, ancient past. And what he sees is basically this idea that Howard plays around with a lot of a once grand race declining. And there's this constant theme of rising up and then decline in Robert E. Howard's works. And, this one is kind of like a genetic decline. So I'll just read the comparison. Cast in the mold of humanity, the ancient builders of the city. Cast in the mold of humanity, they were distinctly not men. They were winged and of heroic proportions. Not a branch in the mysterious stalk of evolution that culminated in man, but the ripe blossom on an alien tree, separate and apart from that stalk. Aside from their wings and physical appearance, they resembled man only as man in his highest form resembles the great apes. In spiritual, aesthetic, and intellectual development, they were superior to man as man is superior to the gorilla. But when they reared their colossal city, man's primal ancestors had not yet risen from the slime of the primordial seas. So you have this grand angelic race. And then, after an earthquake that shook down the outer walls and highest towers of the city and caused the river to run black for days with some lethal substance spewed up from their subterranean depths, a frightful chemical change became apparent in the waters as the folk had drunk for millenniums uncountable. Many died who drank of it, and in those who lived, the drinking wrought change, subtle, gradual, and grisly. In adapting themselves to the changing conditions, they had sunk far below their original level. But the lethal waters altered them even more, horribly, from generation to more bestialed generation. They who had been winged gods became pinioned demons, with all that remained of their ancestors' vast knowledge distorted and perverted and twisted into ghastly paths. As they had risen higher than mankind might dream, so they sank lower than man's maddest nightmares reach. They died fast by cannibalism, and horrible feuds fought out in the murk of the midnight jungle. And at last, among the lichen-grown ruins of their city, only a single shape lurked, a stunted, abhorrent perversion of nature. So, the idea of evolution in the early 20th century wasn't, the way it was striking people, because I don't think this is very scientific, wasn't just that we descended from apes, but that we could degenerate back into apes. And thus, 50 years later, you have Devo, but this is the way they were thinking of this at the time. So
Planet of the Apes.
Right, or Planet of the Apes, right. So there was this constant fear that, we've risen up, but since we're not so special, because we're little more than beasts, because all of our art and religion and philosophy is nothing but the id, in disguise, we could just become beasts again. So this was, one of the themes that you find in Howard. The next story I want to talk about from Howard is Beyond the Black River. I haven't had a chance to reread this, but I read it some years ago. Well, actually, I've read all the stories several times, but it's been a few years since I read this. Basically, in this story, Conan is working as a mercenary for this kingdom called Aquilonia, which is basically pseudo-medieval France, and they're trying to colonize the so-called Pictish wilderness, which is pseudo-frontier America. And things are not going well, and eventually the Picts use magic and just sheer numbers and ferocity to basically kill everybody. And there's a few things in this story that I would like to quote that bring out some of the themes that Howard dwells on. This is from the point of view of the frontiersman who has just met Conan, who is coming out of the wilderness after various adventures. He felt lonely in spite of his companion. Conan was as much a part of this wilderness as Balthus was alien to it. The Cimmerian might have spent years among the great cities of the world. He might have walked with the rulers of civilization. He might even achieve his wild whim someday and rule as a king of a civilized nation. Stranger things had happened, but he was no less a barbarian. He was concerned only with the naked fundamentals of life, the warm intimacies of small, kindly things. The sentiments and delicious trivialities that make up so much of civilized men's lives were meaningless to him. A wolf was no less a wolf because a whim of chance caused him to run with the watchdogs. Bloodshed and violence and savagery were the natural elements of the life Conan knew. He could not, and would never understand the little things that are so dear to the souls of civilized men and women. So this is Howard's view of his hero is just this heart, this savage, ruthless person who is just so much stronger than civilized people whose civilizations basically made them weak. And so you can kind of really see the Texan in here too, I think. The Texan of the boom towns and cow towns. And this is Conan basically telling Balthus, the frontiersman, that you guys are doomed. You'll never be able to conquer these barbarians. Soft-bellied fools sitting on velvet cushions with naked girls offering them iced wine on their knees. I know the breed. They can't see any further than their palace wall. Diplomacy? Hell. They'd fight Picts with theories of territorial expansion. Valinus and men like him have to obey the orders of a set of damned fools. They'll never grab any more Pictish land any more than they'll ever rebuild Venarium. The time may come when they'll see the barbarians swarming over the walls of the eastern cities. A week before, Balthus would have laughed at any such preposterous suggestion. Now he made no reply. He had seen the unconquerable ferocity of the men who dwelt beyond the frontiers. And then later, after the final disaster happens, the quote, I guess this is one of the frontiersmen. Barbarism is the natural state of mankind, the borderer said, still staring somberly at the Cimmerian. Civilization is unnatural. It is a whim of circumstance, and barbarism must always ultimately triumph. So this is Howard's belief that civilization is just like this little bubble that is always doomed to eventually succumb to barbarism, either from within or without. So that was Howard's cheerful worldview. I want to take a moment, you know about this. Yeah, so now I want to take a moment to talk about the Turner Diaries. I did not know about, who knows about this book? You do, you do. Yeah, this is some really ugly shit. I read about this maybe some 20 years ago or something. I forget why. Oh, it was because of McVeigh.
Yeah.
Timothy McVeigh. We remember
Oh, yeah.
the one who blew up the federal building in
Oh,
Oklahoma.
yeah, that's right.
Right. And he had been inspired by this. I took this off of Wikipedia, so you can, I won't read it.
Bible, racist Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has inspired a lot of white nationalist terrorism, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And basically it is a fantasy of a man who believes that the Jewish conspiracy is running things and they're using blacks and other non-white people as their pawns, and that basically there's inevitably going to be a race war.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read this, that's when it clicked about what was going on in the Queen of the Black Coast. And then I was like, oh shit, how did I not see that? Actually, maybe it's good that I didn't see it, that I was not tuned into those kind of things. But I think on reflection, it's good that I am now, because the kind of attitudes, the kind of ways of viewing people, viewing the other in the Queen of the Black Coast is not necessarily innocent. It's kind of insidious. So, it's good, I think, to be aware of how people and different groups are being portrayed and how Howard's fearful way of looking at the world, at civilization, at different races, can really affect the way we relate to each other.
Well, this reminds me of, Howard, of Henry Ford.
Mhm.
See? He's this icon, but he's this total anti-Semitic, racist, anti-labor who just murders people because, oh my God, because you're my labor force, and if you don't like what I give you, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
And so we have these icons still today.
Mhm.
You see.
Yeah.
And so what I'm getting at is the silent complicity in America is this racism throughout.
Right.
All our icons,
Right.
beginning even with Jefferson and Washington, because they were slave owners. They weren't really talking about blacks when they were talking about the Constitution, believe it or not.
Right.
They were talking about white people.
Right.
See, that's the sadness about America.
Yeah.
They weren't really talking about everybody. They were talking about the 1%.
Just the particular
Landowners.
Landowners,
Yeah.
right? Not even all white people.
Yeah,
just
not even
the
white
landowning
people.
white people. Right.
Intellectual white owners,
Right.
you know. But idealistically, as children, that's what we're thinking of, you know.
Right.
And these Turner Diners like flipped it on its head, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
this is what they're really talking about.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
And this is this push-pull of Americana, which is what we see right now.
Right. Right.
Come
Well,
to a head. Well, it's
So
coming to a head.
so I'm not suggesting that Howard was the rabid kind of racist,
Yeah,
the
right,
author of this one. I think he was not, and
No.
there has been critical scholarship on Howard showing what exactly his attitudes were. Apparently they softened over the years. But it's still there.
Mhm.
That kind of view of the other as, predatory
Mhm.
and a threat to civilization is still there. And it's good for us to be aware of it, I think. So, moving along. Now I want to talk about H.P. Lovecraft. Now, he was a virulent racist.
Oh.
I'm not even going to quote the really ugly racist stuff that I found in his stories. And also, I don't want to just talk about racism. There's bigger themes here.
Mhm.
But again, I am going to talk about the fear of the other, the fear that mankind and civilization is just a little blip that is constantly under threat and almost will inevitably be washed away. Just this idea that we're in a cold, indifferent universe. It's a very nihilistic, fearful view. For those who don't know, because I'm not talking just to people here, but I guess this will eventually, hopefully, be posted to those who may watch the video. I'll just go over who Lovecraft is. He lived from 1890 to 1937. His father, when he was very young, like 4 years old, I believe, was committed to a sanitarium after a mental breakdown. He died in 1898 when Lovecraft was 8 years old of complications arising from syphilis. His mother was institutionalized when he was a teenager. In 1917, he tried to join the National Guard, but failed his physical. And for a long time, I think from 1909 to, I forget the exact dates, but he was kind of a recluse for a very long time. He didn't write, didn't go out, didn't do anything. In 1921, his mother died in the mental institution. His only serious relationship arose in 1924 when he married a woman named Sonia Green, who, oddly enough, was a Russian Jew, because Lovecraft was very anti-Semitic. So there is a big exception there. And because of his relationship with her, he moved to New York City. And that's where it went from kind of this latent kind of racism and reclusiveness to outright rabid xenophobia. And the marriage didn't work out, not because they no longer loved each other, but because of basically economic reasons. She lost her job. He was unable to get any work. She moved to Cincinnati for work. And they never really were able to come together and live together anymore. So eventually he was forced to move back to Providence in 1926. And I think she filed for divorce in 29, but he never actually signed the papers. So oddly enough, this anti-Semitic man, the one real relationship in his life was with this Russian Jewish woman who apparently he did have very deep feelings for, but was unable to really make the relationship work. He wasn't able to adjust himself to the real world and its demands for whatever reasons. But fortunately for horror literature fans, his failures and the fear and loathing that rose up in him from having to live in port, again writing in 1926 with the story of the Call of Cthulhu. And he died in 1937 of intestinal cancer. So he also, I think he traveled up and down the East Coast, but he also, like Howard, really never left his comfort zone as far as the area where he grew up. So I want to talk about a couple of his stories that I think show or express the themes that I want to look at. One is The Silver Key. and it was written in 1926 but not published until 1929. The Silver Key is one of the stories about a character he created named Randolph Carter, and Carter is kind of a Lovecraft stand-in, and he's a dreamer. He's someone who, especially in this particular story, he doesn't want to live in the adult prosaic world. He wants to return to his childhood and to the dreams of his childhood. One of, I think, Lovecraft's great stories, it's really a novella, it's called The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, and it's about how Randolph Carter sets off through this just phantasmagoric, it's the only word I could think of, dream world, both beautiful and fearsome and very Cthulhu-esque, in search of this marvelous city that he's had a vision of. Now in the Silver Key, this Randolph Carter is trying to find his way back to his dreams, back to his childhood. And he's talking about, in the first half of the story, his disillusionment with the world. And many of the things that is expressed in the story are things that Lovecraft also expressed in his letters. So I want to look at that. So Randolph Carter says, "Wise men told him his simple fancies were inane and childish, and he believed it because he could see that they might easily be so. What he failed to recall was that the deeds of reality are just as inane and childish, and even more absurd because their actors persist in fancying them full of meaning and purpose, as the blind cosmos grinds aimlessly on from nothing to something and from something back to nothing again, neither heeding nor knowing the wishes or existence of the minds that flicker for a second now and then in the darkness." So here you have a really clear statement of Lovecraft's nihilism. And here is a little diatribe against religion. "In the first days of his bondage, he had turned to the gentle churchly faith endeared to him by the naive trust of his fathers, for thence stretched mystic avenues which seemed to promise escape from life. Only on closer view did he mark the starved fancy and beauty, the stale and prosy triteness, and the owlish gravity and grotesque claims of solid truth which reigned boresomely and overwhelmingly among most of its professors, or feel to the full the awkwardness with which it sought to keep alive as literal fact the outgrown fears and guesses of a primal race confronting the unknown. It wearied Carter to see how solemnly people tried to make earthly reality out of old myths, which every step of their boasted science confuted, and this misplaced seriousness killed the attachment he might have kept for the ancient creeds had they been content to offer the sonorous rites and emotional outlets in their true guise of ethereal fantasy." So much for religion, or at least traditional religion. What would Lovecraft have thought of, say, Thelema? "But when he came to study those who had thrown off the old myths, he found them even more ugly than those who had not. They did not know that beauty lies in harmony, and that loveliness of life has no standard amidst an aimless cosmos, save only its harmony with the dreams and the feelings which have gone before and blindly molded our little spheres out of the rest of chaos. They did not see that good and evil and beauty and ugliness are only ornamental fruits of perspective, whose sole value lies in their linkage to what chance made our fathers think and feel, and whose finer details are different for every race and culture." Nice of him to admit that. "Instead, they either denied these things altogether or transferred them to the crude, vague instincts which they shared with the beasts and peasants, so that their lives were dragged malodorously out in pain, ugliness, and disproportion, yet filled with a ludicrous pride at having escaped from something no more unsound than that which still held them. They had traded the false gods of fear and blind piety for those of license and anarchy." So he wouldn't have approved of our 21st century freedoms and godlessness either. Now, sorry, this one's a little long. "Carter did not taste deeply of these modern freedoms, for their cheapness and squalor sickened a spirit-loving beauty alone, while his reason rebelled at the flimsy logic with which their champions tried to gild brute impulse with a sacredness stripped from the idols they had discarded. He saw that most of them, in common with their cast-off priestcraft, could not escape from the delusion that life has a meaning apart from that which men dream into it, and could not lay aside the crude notion of ethics and obligations beyond those of beauty, even when all nature shrieked of its unconsciousness and impersonal unmorality in the light of their scientific discoveries." So you can see the impact that science was having on people like Lovecraft and others. Warped and bigoted with preconceived illusions of justice, freedom, and consistency, they cast off the old lore and the old ways with the old beliefs, nor ever stop to think that lore and those ways were the sole makers of their present thoughts and judgments, and the sole guides and standards in a meaningless universe without fixed aims or stable points of reference. Having lost these artificial settings, their lives grew void of direction and dramatic interest, till at length they strove to drown their ennui in bustle and pretended usefulness, noise and excitement, barbaric display and animal sensation. When these things palled, disappointed, or grew nauseous through revulsion, they cultivated irony and bitterness and found fault with the social order. Never could they realize that their brute foundations were as shifting and contradictory as the gods of their elders, and that the satisfaction of one moment is the bane of the next. Calm, lasting beauty comes only in dream, and this solace the world had thrown away when in its worship of the real, it threw away the secrets of childhood and innocence. So where some people found refuge in punk rock, he found refuge in nostalgia and going back to his childhood. So I find it amazing this is written in the 1930s, really, or sorry, the 20s. The next story, Call of Cthulhu. How could I not cover this one? So this was written in 1926, not published until February 1928. And if anybody cares to see it, if they have not, there is a black and white silent movie that was made in the last 15 or so years. I think it's by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, right? And since they didn't have a budget, they basically, it's like a whole movie. They decided that they would do a movie version of Call of Cthulhu as though it had been made in 1926. Mm-hmm. So it's really brilliant, and I recommend it. It's only 45 minutes long, but it's a lot of fun. It's even more fun watching also on the CD is how they made it. Mm-hmm. So, Call of Cthulhu. The very first paragraph of the story says, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." Mm-hmm. So, he trashed religion, and now he's trashing where science might lead us. Actually, in fairness to him, I think in his letters he shows a more positive view of science. And what he was trying to do in his stories was basically just escapism. You know, he knew reality was prosaic and boring, and science was showing that the advances in science were making the universe more boring every day, at least in his view. And what he wanted to do in these stories was create a strange mood to get us out of ourselves, out of the world. And so he was showing possibilities, very unlikely possibilities in science that would create what he would call a weird tale. So this may not be exactly reflective of Lovecraft's own view, but I think it certainly speaks to a lot of the fears many people at that time, and today too, so many anti-science people today, fear that science is creating a worldview where there's really no place for the human spirit.
Michael?
Yes?
That's one of his most famous quotes.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Now, here I want to show that, because I knew there was some really horrible racist stuff in Lovecraft's writings, particularly in the story of the case of Herbert West Reanimator, that one. But I was a little surprised when I reread Call of Cthulhu and realized that all of the bad guys, the human level bad guys in the story, all the evil cultists, are basically colored people and mixed race people. Mm-hmm. So here are just some examples of that. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimo whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. So the Eskimos are out to get us, or at least some of them are. And then after an investigation and arrest of an evil cult out in the swamps of Louisiana, here's the description of the cultists. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures, mind you, held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. And then later on he talks about, this is Professor Angell, I think, and he's talking about his uncle who was murdered mysteriously in the streets. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels, and a careless push from a Negro sailor. So, and then there is a battle between some, European sailors and these pirates or smugglers, whatever they were, out in the seas near the island where Cthulhu lives. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south of her course by the great storm of March 1st, and on March 22nd, in south latitude 49 degrees 51, what is that, 51? Minutes. West longitude 128 degrees 34 minutes, encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-caste. Kanakas are Pacific, no, they're Melanesian, actually. During a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. This is one of the survivors from the attack on the Emma. Two Lascar sailors, those are people from the East Indies, Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. So there's this constant theme in the Call of Cthulhu that, that these other people, these other races and groups, and especially half-castes, or people of mixed race, are basically out to get us, and they're worshiping these monsters from beyond space and time. So there you go. Yes?
Is he trying to say also that all of these paragraphs are from the surrounding area that Cthulhu dwells on?
No, it's all over the world, because the island Early rises up in the South Pacific. But here you have the Eskimo
Louisiana.
And in Louisiana, and he's basically trying to show all over the world.
Okay.
Yeah, and I didn't put the quote in here, but he also talks about people in China and Tibet. And basically he just kind of slams everyone who's not a European or
And
American
this is all
white
from
man.
the entirety of Cthulhu?
From all these quotes are from the Call of Cthulhu,
Okay.
from that one particular story.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So it's funny, when you read this as a kid, this just goes right over your head. You don't see this. At least, I didn't. So now that I'm a little more sensitized to these things, I read these stories now, I'm like, wow, how did I miss that? And then here's a little more about that fear of anarchy and amorality. Then whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great ones showed them. Idols brought in dim arias from dark stars. He's talking about occults in a dim, remote, prehistoric past. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. So I sometimes wonder if Lovecraft ever got a hold of the Book of the Law. You can just imagine how he would have reacted. Or maybe this is his reaction if he had ever come across it. All right, so much for Lovecraft and his cosmic fears and racism and nihilism. Now I want to talk about Aleister Crowley. I'm pretty sure everybody here knows who he is, but for the sake of others, He lived from 1875 to 1947. He grew up in a rabidly fundamentalist Christian household. His father was a preacher in the Plymouth Brethren. His father, however, died when he was, I think he was 12. And at that time, Crowley became, or so he says in his confessions, very disillusioned with Christianity. Seeking elsewhere, he read a lot of books on alchemy and hermeticism. In November 18th, 1898, he was initiated into the Golden Dawn, which I guess you would say that was the premier hermetic organization in the late 19th century in England. After that came crashing down. He wandered about, climbed a few mountains, got married, and in 1904 he had dictated to him the Book of the Law, which, according to what the book itself says and what Crowley later said, is, I guess you could say, the revelation and constitution of the new age that humankind is to be ushered into, or is being ushered into. In 1907, he established the AA, not the Alcoholics Anonymous, but I think it means Silver Star in Latin, so I won't try to say what the Latin words are. I'll probably get it wrong. But the AA was meant to be kind of a one-on-one training program for those who wish to learn Hermeticism and ceremonial magic. Basically to find, using Western methods analogous to the Eastern methods of yoga and meditation, although it also incorporated those, find one's inner genius. In 1913, he was initiated into the O.T.O, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and composed the Gnostic Mass, which is celebrated here every Sunday and elsewhere around the world. In 1914 and 1919, he was in the United States, strangely enough, writing pro-German propaganda against the British. He later said that he was doing that deliberately, both to spy on the Germans and to write such egregiously exaggerated, horrendous propaganda that it would turn people against the Germans. And it worked, because we went to war against Germany for the English in 1917, was it? So, sorry, I didn't read up on World War I. From 1920 to 1923, he established the Abbey of Thelema in Cthulhu, where he could use the different methods that he had developed, that he had learned and also developed. And he was kicked out by Mussolini in 1923. He spent the rest of his life sometimes in Paris, mostly in England. He also wandered around to different places in Africa, in North Africa. In 1947, he died of chronic bronchitis. So a much longer and more adventurous and more worldly life than Lovecraft or Howard. So there's a huge amount of material here. So basically, I restricted myself to essays he wrote that were collected in this book, The Revival of Magic, and other essays. And I wanted to restrict myself to these because they're written roughly the same time period that Lovecraft and Howard were writing. And also, it's kind of hard to find this. A lot of these essays are not available online. It's a relatively hard book to find. And also, and most importantly, I think it's some of his clearest writing on his ideals and his views. This is the most user-friendly, accessible stuff that I've come across, I think even more than Magic Without Tears. So I wanted to share some things from here, and then open it up to discussion. So the first one I want to look at is Humanity First. It was published in a magazine called The International in November 1917. I would like to say that this is absolutely what Crowley thought it is, but I have to admit that The International was one of the magazines that the Germans were putting out. The other one was called The Fatherland. And that Crowley was taking some perhaps hypocritical jibes at the British. And that his tongue was firmly placed in cheek in at least a couple places in this little essay, especially where he talks about Jesus. So you'll see what I mean. But on the other hand, his vision of, a universal humanity that, and transcending bigotry is something that I think he really did believe for the sake of Thelema, for the sake of the Book of the Law, which says the law is for all. So I would like to share pretty much the whole essay. It's very short. He wrote, "It may be that one day the gold plate with its diamond inscriptions may be stripped by some vandals, Macaulay's New Zealander or another, from my sarcophagus. It may be that centuries later, still the learned archaeologists of some nation yet unguessed, excavating the ruins of Westminster Abbey, may find those bones and send them to the anatomist for examination." I'm amused that he is projecting that he will be in a gold-plated sarcophagus in Westminster. "The report of these anatomists may be something in these terms. These are the bones of a mammal, a primate, Homo sapiens. The skull is not prognathous. This person was probably a Caucasian. In such a judgment, I acquiesce with pleasure. It would be limitation to be described as this German or this Japanese. Man is man, and in him burns the mystic flame of Godhead. It is a blasphemy to discriminate further." That's pretty clear. To antithesize the Russian against the Turk in any matter more serious than national belief, custom, or costume. All advanced thinkers, all men who realize the divine plan, desire and intend the solidarity of humanity, and a patriot in the narrow and infuriated sense of that word is a traitor to the true interests of man. That's pretty clear. Traitor to the true interests of man. That's Crowley. And now, I will grant, maybe you can take this essay with a grain of salt, but I think he was speaking sincerely there. I would like to believe that that's what he really meant. "It may be necessary now and then to defend one's own section of mankind from aggression, but even this should always be done with the mental reservation, may this war be the nurse of a more solid peace, may this argument lead to a better understanding, may this division lead to a higher union. A man's worst enemies are those of his own household, and the worst foes of any nation are its petty patriots. Patriotism is the last resort of a scoundrel." These are quotes from Samuel Johnson, by the way, not Crowley, but he put them in there. Yes?
It's perhaps worth remembering, since he's writing this in 1917, and those two world wars a long time ago and a little bit differently motivated, that of course there were no Nazis yet.
Right, that's true.
So he's not coming out against German Nazi propaganda, but you could almost say mere imperialism and the
Right.
hubris of the Kaiser.
Right.
Although a lot of that stuff was kind of starting to bubble under, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion existed at this point, and I think was already debunked by 1917. Not that anybody cared that it was debunked.
Right. Right. Very good
Jews
point.
were still seen as the European problem,
Yeah.
especially the bankers.
Yeah. And when
Rothschilds were basically irrelevant by that point
Right.
in terms of high finance.
And when World War II did break out, he was very firmly against the Nazis and against Hitler. So, yeah, that's a very good point. Moving along with the essay, he says the deliberate antagonizing of nations is the foulest of crimes. It is the press of the warring nations that, by inflaming the passions of the ignorant, Fox TV, has set Europe by the ears. Had all men been educated and traveled, they would not have listened to those harpy shrieks. Now the mischief is done, and it is for us to repair it as best we may. This must be our motto, humanity first. All persons who generalize about nations, Germans are all murderers, Frenchmen are all adulterers, Englishmen are all snobs, Russians are all drunkards, and so on, must be silenced. Wow, must be silenced. All persons who cling to petty interests and revenges must be silenced. We must refuse to listen to any man who does not realize that civilization itself is at stake, that even now Europe may be so weakened that it may fall a prey to the forces of atavism, that war may be followed by bankruptcy, revolution, and famine, and that even within our own lifetime the Tower of the Ages may be fallen into unrecognizable ruins. We must refuse to listen to any man who has not resolutely put away from him all limited interests, all national passion, who cannot look upon wounded humanity with the broad, clear gaze, passionless and yet compassionate, of the surgeon, or who is not single-minded in his determination to save the life at whatever the cost of mutilation in a particular limb. So,
Wow.
yeah. Yeah. And I want to note here that unlike Howard and Lovecraft, who seem to feel that barbarism was inevitable he seems to be saying that, we can do something about this. We don't have to destroy our civilization.
We can be better.
We can be better.
Yeah.
Right. There's a much more positive view here, both of people in general and of our ability to do something about our situation. He says, we must listen both to the German who understands that England is a great and progressive and enlightened nation whose welfare is necessary to the health of Europe, and to the Frenchman who sees in Germany his own best friend, the model of science, organization, and foresight, which alone can build up the fallen temple anew. We must listen to the Englishman who is willing to acquiesce in the freedom of the seas, and to the Russian who acknowledges that it is time to put a term to the tyranny of arms and the menace of intrigue. The yelping press of every country, always keen to gather pennies from the passions of the unthinking and unknowing multitude, will call every such man a traitor. So be it. Let the lower interest be betrayed to the higher, the particular benefit of any given country to the commonwealth of the whole world. Let us no more consider men, but man. Let us remember who came, and here, I think it's tongue-in-cheek here. Let us remember who came from heaven and was made flesh among the Jews, not to lead his own people to victory, not to accept that partial dominion of the earth, but to bring light and truth to all mankind. Yes, I'm going to use your Christianity against you, is basically what he's doing. Had the Savior of humanity designed to accept the patriotic mission of driving out the Romans, he would have united his nation, but man would have not been redeemed. Therefore his people called him traitor and betrayed him to their own oppressors. Fair enough. And then he ends the essay with, let those who are willing, as he was, as Jesus was, to accept the opprobrium, and if need be, the cross, come forward, let them bear the oriflamme of the sun for their banner, for that the sun shineth alike upon all the nations of the earth, and let them ever flash in the forefront of their battle this one redeeming thought, humanity first. So,
How cosmopolitan.
Yeah, exactly. That's written in New York in 1917. So, I was very happy to read that, especially considering certain debates going on right now. Online, yes. So, if you don't like those ideas, too bad Crowley wrote them. And granted, those of us who are Thelemites don't have to do everything that Crowley says, and don't have to feel or think the way he does, but still, he was the first Thelemite, so I think it's worth considering. So the next essay this one was never published as far as I can tell. It was called The Beginning of the New World, written around 1925. I think it might have been something he privately circulated, or maybe it was a note. There's a couple more sentences about it in the book, but I'm not going to look it up now. And it's almost like an attempt to create a very short, clear manifesto of Thelema. So once again, I'll read through all of this. Unrest is the sign of this moment. No man, however rich or safely placed, feels sure of next week. No man knows where he is going. This is because no man knows where he ought to go. The bases of society have been so shaken that it's become impossible for anyone to make a plan, just as a banker or a surveyor could now, I guess that should be, could not work if he were no longer sure of the multiplication table. Now this state of things is not wholly due to the actual conditions of material existence, to political unrest, or to economic confusion. Circumstances have not the power to wreck the soul of a man as long as he has in himself adequate driving power and wit and skill to steer. So take that, you whiny Randolph Carter, in your childhood dreams. So, continuing on to this essay. When men have a definite aim to pursue, they instinctively find means of overriding mutual interference, and may even work together, unselfishly, as it is polishedly called, to obtain their separate ends with a minimum of friction. But when they are aimless, they become distracted and witless. They push each other aside in their desperation. Even the simplest task becomes impossible. Today, the mass of mankind no longer has any law by which to live, any unchallenged principle of right action. The one deep cause of the present universal anarchy is the loss of all man's moral sanction. The many religions of the world have all lost their power to guide, chiefly because the development of means of transport and of international commerce have convinced the educated that any one religion is about as good or bad as another for the purposes of social discipline, and that none has any validity from the standpoint of actual fact or historical or philosophical truth. So isn't this the attitude Conan was expressing, basically, in the conversation with Bali and also Randolph Carter? Before I move on to the next part of the essay, I do have to admit that the first part is very idealistic, the idea that we can all harmonize and work together. But on the other hand, it may be the most realistic thing. You know, we can't get anything done if we're constantly at loggerheads with each other. And if people would take the time and patience and imagination and creativity to find ways to work together, people would get stuff done.
Yes.
Well, that's what's so revolutionary about the social contract.
Yeah.
With him.
Yeah.
He said, hello, you
Right.
know, that was a profound philosophical statement that we could actually do things.
But the problem with it is people said, okay, we'll have a social contract as long as it's with our in-group, the people who are like us.
Our own self-interest.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have to recognize that that self-interest isn't just an arbitrarily drawn in-group, but what Crowley said about humanity first. It's
What
all
I'm-
of us are in this together.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about is the, what is that, the Chinese, not Lao, Sun,
Some
Sun Tzu?
yes.
Oh, the way,
The war.
the book about fighting wars?
Yes.
I have not
But
read that, so I
actually,
don't.
it's about preventing war,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about action-reaction,
Right.
you know, and how to harmonize
They're
and
talking about the art of war.
the art of
The art of war,
yes,
that's
yeah.
it, yeah.
The art of war
But-
is very much
But
kind
that's
of like
what,
working.
but that's, if you think about it, that the social contract began all the revolutions.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, that was the
What
movement.
got the ball rolling, yeah.
But yeah, that was the movement.
Right.
And see, humanism was the next evolution, as it were. Of
Yeah.
So that's why one world government, one world philosophy
Right.
is an extension.
And that's, I think, really at the heart of it, Crowley he is a mystic, but he's a humanistic mystic.
Mhm.
I would say tentatively.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Isn't the devil a humanist?
Yeah, there we go, yes. Right. Yes, and he is also the great wild beast. Yes. Moving along. The remedy is evidently to be found only in one way. There must be found a formula based upon absolute common sense, without one trammel of theological theory or dogma, a formula to which no man of intelligence can refuse assent, and which at the same time affords an absolute sanction for all laws of conduct, social or political, no less than individual, so that the right or wrong of any isolated or concerted action can be determined with mathematical accuracy by any trained observer, entirely irrespective of his personal idiosyncrasies. This formula must be scientific, not religious. This formula is, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, which of course comes from the Book of the Law, for those who have not read it yet. This formula does not, as ignorant or malicious people pretend, mean do anything you like. On the contrary, it is the most severe self-control of every individual or social unit to concentrate its whole energy performing its true proper function. And this function is to be determined by a profound, accurate calculation of the potentials inherent in its constitution. The first practical step towards this end is the formation of a strong central organization to direct coherently the activities of the numerous adherents already established in many countries. I suspect he might be talking about the role of the O.T.O. in the future. It will then be necessary to converse the conferences of experts in all the sciences which treat of mankind in its social and individual character in order to draw up a comprehensive international program. So it's very ambitious and perhaps overly idealistic view. I can just see people lining up to go to the vocation office to figure out what their true purpose is. Yeah, probably not.
If that's the only way
Well,
to
see,
get your
yeah.
government cheese.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, that's communism. That's,
Yeah, they tried to do it that way.
Yeah.
We saw how well that worked out.
yeah,
too.
right.
So,
It's aspirational. I mean, it's also a form of sympathetic magic. This is what he wanted to
Yeah.
put out to the future.
right.
And, you know, William has had, or OTO's had its ups and downs
Yeah.
and nearly been wiped out. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's grown back, and I think it's grown a lot stronger.
And I certainly don't object at all to the idea that an organization can be set up that will help people help themselves find their true purpose.
Yeah, it's all about it.
And when you think about it, we do have life coaches wandering about all over the countryside, supposedly helping people to do this, find out what their capabilities are, what they enjoy, what, they may or may not know what they're doing. This may or may not be, I don't know. Yeah, but I think it's kind of in line with what he's looking at here. So, hopefully I have time for just one more little essay to talk about. This one is on Thelema. Again, it was not published anywhere. It was written in 1926, 27, same time as called Cthulhu. I have a Tao symbol there for a reason. And this, I was debating whether or not to use this because I knew I might run out of time, but this is such a perfect rejoinder to that opening paragraph of the Call of Cthulhu about, how if we pieced all of our knowledge together, it would open these terrifying vistas and we would go mad. This is the perfect rejoinder to that. This is not the whole essay, just some excerpts. It should be clear from the foregoing that the law of Thelema, do what thou wilt, must be a logical rule of conduct to anyone who accepts the above premises. For the ultimate will of every conscious being must be to so increase his general experience as to understand and know himself, which he can only do by studying and understanding the whole universe. That the task is endless is no detriment to this process, but makes it all the more interesting. It is the way of the Tao. Finality would cloy. It's supposed to be an endless process. And he further clarifies, now then, with regard to the explanation of the law given elsewhere in the book of the law, love is a law, love under will. While will, as above shown, is of absolute and ethical validity, it can only be executed by the process of assimilation of all foreign elements, that is, by love. So he's not talking about romantic love, he's talking about reaching out and coming to terms with everything around you, because you are everything, ultimately. To refuse to unite oneself with any phenomena soever is to deprive oneself of its value, even of life itself, as in the case of the Black Brothers, shut up in the abyss, and doomed to conscious disintegration in the realm of disconnected ideas and experiences to perish with the dogs of reason. Wait, what? What's all that? This is his kind of view of the spiritual path. There's a point where you have contacted your inner genius, or it has contacted you, your so-called angel. You now have your direction, at least approximately, and you're working it out. You are gaining magical power, which could be understood as the power to live intentionally and in harmony with your environment and mastering yourself and your environment. And then you reach a point where you realize you have to cross this, you have to transcend the limitations of common sense and rationality and to a bigger, wider view of how things really are. You have to let go of yourself. And then you will be restored to yourself ultimately, or maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. There will be a restoration, but in a very different manner. But if you refuse to do that, you're basically locking yourself into a very stagnant, egotistical, fixed view that will ultimately disintegrate whether you want it to or not. And that's why, and he refers to the people who do that as the Black Brothers on the edge of the abyss. And they're bound up with their idea of what will serve me, what will maintain myself, their reason. Because, yes. Why are you doing this? Well, because, so I can get this, and this. This refusal is only enacted when one is convinced that the new phenomena is hostile to the set of experiences already acquired and made part of oneself. You don't want to go out of your comfort zone. Oh my God, I might have to change my ideas and the way I relate to myself and other people. But it is a serious mark of imperfection, of grave failure to realize the facts in the matter, to take this attitude. Even supposing for one brief moment, and for argument's sake alone, that the new idea under consideration is so incompatible with the experiences already acquired and assimilated that their destruction is necessitated if it is to be accepted, then one fact stands out vividly, showing clearly that the old set of experiences is so imperfect as to be actually unfitted to continue its erstwhile existence. Its destruction would be an advantage to that being, enabling a reconstruction along totally different lines. A reconstruction is. So if you can't grow, something's wrong. And if you have a shattering experience and allows you to grow again, then that's good. Is what he's saying there in so many words. And finally, to end the presentation part of this, There is a work called The Great Learning. This is basically all of it. It's a Chinese Confucian text, one of the 4 great texts that Neo-Confucians were supposed to study. And I can only imagine that Crowley must have read it, because he seems to have read all of the translations of Asian works that were coming out in the 19th century. This one is by James Legge, done in 1893. And it sounds so much like what Crowley was just saying in that essay. I'll just point out, which part? I'll just point out this middle part here. Things have their root in their branches. Affairs have their end in their beginning. To know what is first and what is last will lead near to what is taught in the great learning. The ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. The character for heart is also mind. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things. Things being investigated, knowledge became complete. Their knowledge being complete, their thoughts were sincere. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were then rectified. And so on until you get the whole kingdom was made tranquil and happy. So you have to bring things back to the center and expand outward in your knowledge of all things. And then everything will be rightly ordered. This may not be a Taoist text, and he was very enamored of Taoism, but I think it's the kind of Chinese thinking that Crowley seemed to be enamored of throughout his entire life. And it seems entirely in harmony with his ideas about Thelema as expressed in those essays. And you can see how this, which was written, more than 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, is such a different way of looking at the world than what Lovecraft and Howard were doing. Instead of looking with fear and trepidation and the idea that, knowledge and civilization are going to destroy us, or rather that civilization is doomed and our growing knowledge will expose us to these horrible dangers. Instead to, find harmony in the center and expand out. Much more positive, much more proactive, much more constructive way of viewing things. And so that's, I think, ultimately how I view Lovecraft versus Conan and Cthulhu, as this more constructive, harmonizing, positive attitude, as opposed to the kind of nihilism and fear of the other that, is found in those stories, which nevertheless are still fun reads, although, there's some problems, but fun reads, but I wouldn't want to live that way. So with that, I will finish my presentation and open it up to any of your comments or questions.